Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist and partner here at TCS, and I'm really excited that you've joined me today and our guest. Our guest today is Giri Athuluru. Thanks for joining us, Giri.
Thank you very much for having me, Kevin. Pleasure is all mine.
So this is going to be a very exciting, to me anyway, interview because Giri's the co-founder and CEO of a company called ExperienceFlow.ai. And as you can see by the name, we're going to talk a lot about AI today. And it's always exciting to me to take things out of the academic realm and into the front lines where Giri and his team are engaged with companies in solving real world problems. So with that, Giri, let me just ask you, where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from San Francisco.
All right. And what's the weather like in San Francisco today?
It is as gloomy as it can be. There's this fog that comes in. It's got a name. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah.
Carl the fog. I think like it's he has not moved in a while. So we've not been getting much of sun actually.
I remember they always say the coldest weather I've ever experienced is summertime in San Francisco.
It's true. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I mean, like if you just move little south, I think the temperature warms up by almost like 5 degrees.
Yes. Oh man. So let's jump in and just start talking about AI, Giri. So there are many kinds of different AI. There are umbrella terms like narrow and general and super intelligence. And then there are kind of unique focus areas around AI like machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, computer vision, explainable AI. Where is your team's focus in all of these different terms?
Yeah, there's a lot to chew out there. But as a practitioner and as a solution builder, we're not married to a specific AI. We use a lot of AI, which is on the cutting edge. To name a few, like Graph AI is one that I'm going to talk a lot about today. And then another big piece that we use again on the cutting edge is reinforcement learning. And the third piece is AutoML. As a core offering of ExperienceFlow.ai, we have a product called Digital Nervous System. And that's the crux of our offering. And that is all built around various technologies, including like, essentially software technologies, which basically pull out data and create meaning out of that data. And what we call is, it is extracting experiences, past and present experiences, from which you can learn best practices that enterprises actually enable naturally as humans in terms of making decision making, right? And those experiences, then we pipe it into what we call as AI agents. And these AI agents are enabling decision makers at all levels, from top to bottom, to guide and make the most optimal decision in each situation. So that's the crux of our offering. And in terms of placing us, where does the solution fall? I think Gartner and Forrester are chasing this category called as decision intelligence. I think it started coming up the ranks in the last couple of years once the pandemic hit and digitization took off. I'm not fully sure, essentially digital intelligence is the right category for us, because most of the digital intelligence players that we see are all talking about insights, stories, digital stories, etc. So, but I feel like that's the closest. And I think I want to kind of carve out a new corner in that space, which I want to call it as artificial decision intelligence. And the reason for that being, essentially, decision-making in enterprises is extremely complicated, right? And in order to automate that aspect of decision-making, you need something that can be like human, that can actually reason things, that can actually make sequential decisions that are optimal in a quarter and a year. So the decision that you take today might not be that material, but it might be material in a long horizon, right? So things like that. So that's why I want to call it as an artificial decision intelligence space. But to kind of give you an analogy, what this means is, to me, I think the closest that I can think of is like Tesla's FSD. I'm sure you've heard of Tesla's FSD. So you can think of Tesla's FSD, but for decision making in enterprise for every role in the organization. So that's what we bring to the table.
Oh, that's brilliant. Giri, historically, when I look at AI, I see it being implemented kind of in manufacturing floors and in kind of rote environments that are like robotic process automation, where you can train it and it just knows what to do in simple environments. Now, it sounds to me like you're pushing up or kind of pushing the envelope up into more and more of strategy and decision-making by those in leadership positions. Am I understanding that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think like it's an evolution of a research-oriented technology, right? You got to kind of first find what is the best way to productize it, right? And I think like the simplest and easy to understand, because essentially cutting edge technology takes a lot of money. Like you can only get money for use cases where you can actually deliver value quickly. So in that sense, I think like robotics, where essentially there is a big application for that, right? And also there is like a lot less hurdles as well. The hurdles that we face in our frontier, which is essentially enterprise side, is we don't have much data. The data is extremely sparse. And the kind of decision making that we're talking about is extremely different from the person who is at the forefront of a customer or a partner versus a CEO or a CFO, right? So essentially, productizing AI at this level takes a different evolution, and not just of AI, but software engineering, data availability, infrastructure, scalability, hardware, etc. So I think like what you're saying rightly is the first steps have been taken through robotics. And I think that I feel the next big step that we are all seeing live, that we're experiencing, is Tesla. I mean, essentially, to me, that's a gigantic AI, right? And I think like what we are doing now is taking similar sets of principles, but applying it in an enterprise localized to their environment.
That's fascinating. So that kind of leads me or segues me into the next question that I had lined up here, which was, where are the limits of AI today? So you're pushing the envelope yourself by moving it up the kind of the value chain there. But talk to me about, where are the limits in 2022?
There's a lot to unpack there, Kevin. I think like there's a lot, and I think like experts have their own view. I mean, when I think of experts, I'm talking about like researchers in universities or people who are in DeepMind or in OpenAI. But from my perspective as a practitioner, and a personal enthusiast of AI, I think of this in three different dimensions, right? So the first and foremost limit that mostly gets talked about in my mind is actually this concept called as artificial general intelligence, right? AGI. Can AI become equivalent to a human brain and human intelligence, right? The second thing that is associated with this first thing that doesn't get that much of limelight, which I think is a lot more important, because coming from enterprise space, is the hardware infrastructure. There are big open questions. Can essentially the current infrastructure become as parallel as a human brain, and can it actually do the same amount of calculations, etc., at scale, right? And here I have a slightly different view as well. You know that I'm Indian. I come from a different kind of a background, which is rooted in what I call as yogic culture, right? And I know that you kind of interface with a lot of Indians, etc. The yogic culture essentially has a different view of intelligence, and it thinks of intelligence in a higher dimension that is beyond like the physical dimension of brain, right? So I think of essentially whatever we do with whatever currently is possible, I think like we'll only be scratching the surface of what human intelligence can actually achieve. I would highly recommend, if you have not come across this guru / mystic called as Sadhguru. I don't know if you've heard of him. So he's been interviewed by some of the biggest neuroscientists of our era right now in Harvard and other places. And he specifically makes this point, right? So essentially, he feels like there is a dimension beyond physical. So this is one category of questions and limits, right? Can we do AGI? Can we scale the infrastructure to meet the same kind of capabilities that human brain has? The second big thing that I think about is, as a society, are we ready for the transformation that this AI revolution, even what is actually possible right now, is capable of? Are we ready for that, right? And actually, like, interestingly, like many of the jobs are going to change. Their natures are going to change, right? People have to kind of learn new kind of skills, new kind of opportunities, right? And interestingly, software is one of them. Like many of the software jobs are going to go away. And I'm sure you kind of heard of it. This OpenAI released GPT-3, which has a version called Autopilot, which can actually spit out code. You can just talk to it and it can spit out code. So a lot of people are getting outdated here, right? And then the third big dimension that I could kind of think about is like, do we have guardrails to limit the bad actors? And with the technology that we have, even with what we have right now, there could be a lot of bad actors, right? So those are the dimensions in which I kind of unpack the limits and the state of AI. I will go back to the essence of what we offer and how I think about the state of 2022 AI. So to me, there are two dimensions. Some is extremely basic. So basically today, most enterprises still need a lot of education in terms of what is AI capable of and how to enable it, right? And unfortunately, they do not have bandwidth to kind of enable it or the resources, because enterprises have to continue to keep going. And what AI truly offers is something like, which is completely new stuff. You need to completely throw away existing culture, existing processes, etc., and all stuff. So they're not ready for it. So what happens is everybody wants to start doing some point exercise, like, let's say apply AI here, AI there, etc. And that, to me, I feel is a good start, but probably eventually everybody will see that you kind of need to kind of, rethink this, right? That is one cultural limitation that I see to AI. The second big thing I come back to is this architecture and scalability, etc. There is this person who is credited with the modern revolution of AI called as Professor Jeffrey Hinton. He's now part of Google Brain. I was listening to his podcast with Peter Abil recently, and he's basically of the opinion that the only way we can actually scale the hardware part of AI is to make organic AI, that is use and throw. So it's like it's completely out there.
Oh my.
Yes. So I feel like, the big thing to me for 2022 is education, enabling organizations to have a good strategy for AI, work backwards rather than doing point experiments, like have a broader strategy, a 3 to 5 year strategy, work backwards. And then also think about like, how to change the culture of the organization, because it's all kind of, ties in together.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can imagine, Giri, that a lot of our thinking, remembering, processing, calculating, all those kinds of responsibilities are kind of easy work for AI. So then you start looking at the work that managers do and supervisors do, approving this, looking at this, creating new budgets, all that. But it seems to me that has to follow rational, logical processes, and as such would be fair game for anything having to do with AI. And so that means they're going to need to do something else in their role that adds value to the enterprise, as you're saying. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like I'll also not say that AI alone carries the weight of this, right? Like I said, hardware is a big piece. I think software engineering is a big piece too. So essentially, to me, just basically, getting the data in the right format, organizing that very well, what we call as experiences, all of that stuff is essentially a lot of work that essentially enterprises have to think about in order to enable this vision, right? So it's not just AI, but at the same time, like, the question I think that you're asking is, what is left? What will these roles do beyond this, right?
Mm-hmm.
That to me is a complex question. So I think none of this stuff is going to happen overnight, right? It's a journey that we have to take. And I feel like, that's out there. I mean, we are worrying about it too soon, right? To me, I think the biggest thing that we should worry about right now is things that we can contribute to in a positive way. I feel like, and I'm sure you can relate to this, enterprises like that are in healthcare, manufacturing, high tech, supply chain, they are kind of not realizing it, but they're playing a zero-sum game, right? There's only so many resources in the planet, right? There's only so many skilled people in this planet, right? And I think like the wastage that is happening right now by not being efficient is basically having an impact. We're not realizing it, but I think like we're come to a tipping point, and you can see climate change is happening. I think pandemic to me is also is an effect of how connected we have become, right? So I feel essentially at this point, we should start enabling AI in the best possible way to kind of, start contributing to the society in a positive way. And I think like we as humans, like I was going back to my original point, there is some human intelligence that is like beyond all this. And I think we are completely capable of, figuring out what's next for us. So it's all positive, but I think getting through this journey is going to be a lot of iterations. We'll all have to kind of pull in our different thoughts and ideas and solutions to move this journey forward, but it's all positive.
Now, you brought up both on this recording and when you and I were discussing kind of the framework for our discussion today earlier, a week or so ago, we talked about the concept of enterprise AI. Tell me about how you would define that as different from, just a business process with AI involved.
Okay, so let's think about in the context of experience flow, because I'm sure everybody has different things going on. So experience flow, in a simplest sense, is automating decision making. And decision making, actually, if you think about enterprises from vertical to vertical, the decision making differs, right? And then within the same vertical, the decision making differs from region to region. And also it differs from business to business because each business is trying to offer a differentiated service, right? So, and an enterprise itself is comprised of different decision-making nodes, different factors. There is competition, there is market. So it's extremely complicated decision-making framework, right? So in order to build this, the central most thing that your AI needs to have is an ability to generalize. And this is where our core technology that we use is what I broadly call as Graph AI is involved. And there are different aspects of Graph AI. It's graph databases, there are probabilistic graphs, which are not based on structure, graph structure, but they can learn essentially patterns, they can learn relationships, etc. And then there is graph neural networks, which can also learn patterns at a graph scale, right? This whole area that I call as Graph AI, which is responsible for this crux of prioritization, which is generalization. The second bit that that enterprise AIs need to have as well is, once you generalize, how do you actually enable the organization to cohesively act upon a global objective? Every enterprise, essentially anything that is public for sure, has to be profitable, right? Deliver great customer experience, has to survive. Essentially the cost structure has to be something that they can live with, right? And to me, that is another set of problems where we are kind of using technologies like reinforcement learning, which is really good at identifying and stitching best practices. So essentially learning from the experts within and outside, but at the same time coming up with your own advice by stitching different things together, how to find the best path. So in that sense, our enterprise AI is very, very different from what typically people call as AI in the enterprise context. And I think like there's a good way to frame this. There's a professor called Percy Liang, and he he's from Stanford, and he talks about essentially AI can be looked at it from two different perspectives. One perspective is AI as a tool, which is where majority of the solutions are. So essentially, you can build a model, you can collect the data, you can predict what it is going to say, et cetera, and all that stuff. And then there is AI, which is essentially AI as agents who have to kind of live with the probabilistic nature of the world. So enterprise AI and ExperienceFlow's digital nervous system is essentially geared towards this second category of solutions.
It's such a huge task out there. So I'm fascinated just to hear about it and watch what you're doing, Giri. In 2015, I received an invitation to have dinner with Jeffrey Immelt, who at the time was the CEO of General Electric. And one of the things that, as we were having dinner together, one of the things that just impressed me so much is the massive level of complexity of a global multinational holding company that they produce just about everything you can imagine on the planet, including financial services and, wash machines and refrigerators, you name it. So, and I always just wondered, after, having had the discussion with him that evening and just knowing and understanding the level of complexity of his role, I could appreciate how valuable it would be to have graphs that would generalize and try to give you some rules of thumb, if you would, to run an organization like this. Now, not everything is going to be perfect, but there's got to be enough happening in the right direction to keep the organization functioning and delivering on some core KPIs, right? And that has to be a generalization, because no CEO can get down and roll up his sleeves and figure out how to run an assembly line better than anybody else. They just don't have that kind of time. Their whole job has to be generalization.
Absolutely. And I think, and there are ExperienceFlow is being currently implemented with some of these large enterprises, which have such multiple facets. And that was our vision to begin with, because essentially the footprint of these organizations have become so wide and so deep that now essentially, in terms of outcomes, there's significant leakage of value that is happening. They know that. Many of these enterprises, and I'm talking about 10 to 20 to, hundreds of billions of dollars of enterprises. And imagine the impact of leakage that is happening on decision-making side. And it is going to be fatal. To me, I think one of the reasons that I started this company, along with my brother and a couple of passionate investors who have actually run public companies as CEOs, is the effect of poor decision-making at their scale is now going to be material to the planet and the people on it. So, and I've been fortunate to kind of have gone through some journeys to take on this challenge. So I feel this is a must-have right now for sure.
Wow. So when I think about AI, I think of, a lot of code, a lot of databases, a lot of algorithms, but there has to be that interface. So in your world, what does that interface look like? Is it a young lady with freckles? That's an avatar speaking in a British accent? Or, what is it?
I love British accents. So I think I don't know who said it, but essentially technology should be seamless and be behind the scenes, right? And I think that still applies. In our context, since it's decision making, since it is generalized, we believe the right approach to this is to have a conversational interface, right? And obviously in that, in order for humans to kind of relate to what is that conversation going to lead to, we have to kind of draw some boundaries. And this is basically obviously early days. And the boundary that we obviously draw is a set of agents. And since we are actually mimicking human decision making, we are actually modeling a continuous improvement loop. So we have actually 3 AI agents, not one. So one is for planning. The other one is actually for enabling those decisions in real time. And the third one is to actually learn continuously. So, and then they all work in tandem to build this continuous loop for every human being, because that's how we are, right? From where you are today, you're like possibly going, after this call, you're going to plan for your day, plan for your week, your weekend, etc. But the things don't go according to the plan. Something or the other will happen. Then you will react to it based on whatever criteria that you have to make sure that your plan has to adhere to. And then you kind of also learn, something didn't go, the plan didn't go as per the plan. So we have kind of modeled that continuous improvement loop as 3 different agents, and they interface with the human on the other side using a conversation. But there is a lot of AI that we use that doesn't have any personality. It basically provides the right result. For example, optimization. Optimization is a difficult problem. It is basically running on its own in the background in a simulated environment, and it just pushes out, hey, here is what I think is the possibility that you can achieve. So there's all kinds of flavors, but I believe essentially conversational AI is going to definitely, or conversational interface is going to be the primary interface wherever there's a dialogue between AI and humans.
Is it a lecture or the conversation as you identified? Is it more of a conversation, or is it more of a podcast kind of, let's hear what our AI is going to recommend it to us?
So it depends upon the context. So essentially, and also who you are in the organization, right? So as you go up the chain, essentially your nature of your work essentially enables you to kind of think about your business in a slightly different way. And many times you have to kind of think about, situations, scenarios, planning scenarios, etc. Right? So you kind of have to do simulations, etc. And that part is a lot of reasoning. So you'll have to kind of have a dialogue, right? Whereas while you go down the chain, right? To me, I think the same functionality definitely applies to the, there as well. But the ratio of that changes. You're so busy, you're so tied up. You're somebody in a manufacturing plant, or you're somebody in a supply chain, or you're somebody who's facing a customer. You don't have time for having a dialogue. You just need hey, what do I need to do? What do I need to prioritize? So you just publish, AI should publish what to do, and then learn from that, hey, what is this person reacting to, and personalize, because a skilled versus somebody who's a newbie, what you publish has to be different, and it has to be personalized. Yeah.
Wow. So there's some that envision a time when every worker, when they join a company, will simply be automatically assigned, just like they're given an employee ID. That ID automatically comes with a digital assistant. Yes. That digital assistant is going to help them do everything they need to as an employee: travel expenses, leave request, sick time, you name it. Benefits package, sign up for insurance, you name it. It's going to talk them through it. It's going to remind them. It's going to talk to them. Is that the kind of vision that you have, that someday, no matter what position in the company, everyone gets an employee ID and a digital assistant?
Absolutely. So absolutely. I think that's already happening. I think I know that, sales engineers, call centers are already getting prompted about what to say, what to do. All that stuff is happening real time, right? Whereas our focus is slightly different. We have a niche, and our niche is, driving objectives. Essentially in this graph that we have generalized, we want to ensure that, you get the best out of your, products and services in terms of revenue that you want to get to, or profitability that you want to get to, at the lowest cost possible, or the best customer experience that you want to deliver, right? So in a way, we are like the Tesla FSD. We want to kind of, navigate you into a right direction, depending upon how the situation is evolving. And we will coexist with some of these point AIs that will kind of do employee experience, or some call center experience, etc. But ExperienceFlow is like a digital nervous system. It sits on top of all of this stuff: your data, your existing BI solutions, your existing AI solutions, and then ensure that as an organization, they're all active cohesively towards the objectives that they have.
Wow. So what's stopping companies from doing this today? Why do they hesitate?
Lots of big Big things here, Kevin. First and foremost, essentially, enterprises need to educate themselves about, what is their AI strategy, what is their vision going forward, and then work backwards towards that vision. Right now, today, what happens is it's basically growing in silos, just like enterprise software. And unfortunately, we all go through different waves of innovation. And in the last, I would say, this digitization, et cetera, and all that, we are going through a SaaS wave of innovation, where every feature, every API can be paid for, and it basically creates a bunch of silos, right? You don't have this cohesive view of things, right? But when it comes to AI, which has the capability to cut through all this clutter, you need to actually have a holistic vision of where you want to go and then work backwards. But it's easier said than done. I can totally relate to it, right? We have all been there. Enterprise change management is very difficult. You're running a business. Nobody has the time or bandwidth or the money to kind of actually enable something like this, right? So that is one set of problems. But obviously, that's what has always been the problem. With anything that is new, there will be some who will be early adopters, who will take that bet, who will take that risk, and they will be the ones who will benefit and who will lead others into this way. There is a second category of things that are also stopping, is basically what I call as business model, right? The business model for this is different. This is a value-based business model, right? Today, essentially, I feel this is going to happen soon. In the last, I would say, decade or so, people have become fatigued with dashboards. Essentially, people have invested a lot in dashboards. You get red, green, blue, yellow, but you don't know what to do next, right? So there is a lot of ROI that's let's questionable in that. And then now you have SaaS, lots of pointed XYZ stuff that is happening, et cetera, and all stuff. So now I think if you are a CIO or if you're a CEO, you've invested in a lot of these technologies, you're going to question am I getting what I was promised, right? And AI is one of those things that is new, and it has a lot of costs involved with it, because people like us who are spending money to kind of build this need to get paid for this. So but at the same time, you got to prove value before you do that, right? So what is the right business model for this, right? So this is something that I believe we have figured out. It's a combination of what we provide as technology and part of value that we create. There's a new business model that needs to be evolved. The associated path with this is also, in my mind, where investments are going on, right? Unfortunately, all said and done, the venture capital, which is the enabler for most of these things, unfortunately, do not spend that much money into hard technologies. Enterprise transformation and stuff like that is not their cup of the cake, because it takes long cycles. They know they're not going to make money, etc. So they are chasing the most efficient way to make money, something that is already proven, that can scale very well. They'll pour money into marketing, sales, etc. So you need a different breed of young entrepreneurial VCs who can actually take this bet, who can enable essentially enterprises to not pay for it until they see value, but at the same time, pay for the technology that is being used for vendors like us, so that we can at least survive and we can continue to build that, right? So essentially, this ecosystem is still not there. And I think it's a gigantic problem, but people like us, I'm sure a lot of other people are also realizing this. We gotta have to kind of figure this way out. And I'm sure every wave, there's going to be a wave when you're going to figure out there's a new business model, there's a new financing structure, and there's a new strategy in terms of how to enable AI. It's all going to come together in my mind.
So the last question for you, Giri, is if we put on our futurist hat, we look forward 5 years, what's this going to look like? What's AI? What's ExperienceFlow going to look like in 5 years?
I know it was coming. So it's a loaded question. And I think to me, there are several ways to think about it. first of all, we should think about what happened, which gives us some insight in probably what is going to happen in the next 5 years. See, the modern revolution of AI is only, I would say, about 8 to 10 years old, right? It's basically AlexNet and Jeffrey Hinton and his students who kind of, came up with all this new evolution, new way of kind of, accelerating the neural networks, etc. And since then, if we look at the plethora of things that have happened, it's just mind-boggling. It is just mind-boggling what has happened in the last few years. And it is accelerating really rapidly at all levels. We talk about computer vision, language models. I don't know if you've seen DALL-E from OpenAI, like you talk to it and it'll paint out stuff, right? It's just mind-boggling, right? At the same time, I think there are impediments to actually make it useful, actually make it available and accessible to everybody. Like I said, there is infrastructure issues, there is funding issues, all kinds of those things, right? So having said that, the way I think about next 5 years, to me, it's very hard to predict. But I believe people will definitely zero in on solving the hardware problem. To give you some context, right? I'm sure you know this. Human brain has 80 plus billion neurons, and it has 1,000 trillion synapses, but it only spends 20 watts of energy. Whereas if you compare it with today's supercomputers, they spend megawatts, and they're orders of magnitude poorer than a human brain. Now, you're not going to be able to solve all these ideas that you have, et cetera, and all this stuff, unless you solve this problem. So, and I've just recently, I think maybe yesterday or day before, I saw some news where people are talking about, essentially incorporating neurons into the hardware architecture, et cetera. I think that to me is going to be the enabler. And if that happens, I don't know what's out there in 5 years. Basically, it's unpredictable. But as far as ExperienceFlow is concerned, I feel like given the journey that we have taken so far, and given the journey that the world has taken so far, I believe we would be essentially serving at least a large percentage of the Fortune 500 companies, which basically enable the biggest footprint in terms of decision making and impact on the planet. So that's where we want to be, because to me, I think it's a very personal and a mission-oriented venture. I believe we need more players like us who can actually see this big picture, why AI and how AI, right, in the context of doing good, in the context of being an evangelist. Yes.
Giri, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, insight, and experiences with all of us today.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I want to do this again. I think there's a lot to talk about here, and I think we're just getting started.